Greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York, side of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. And we're very glad that you can join us today for a special program. It is our virtual author series, and it is an especially timely program. We'll explain that in a moment. We're going to be talking to our good friend, longtime writer, historian, really an expert on broadcasting, but also on many other things as well, both in the baseball and political worlds. Our friend Curt Smith. Our talk with him is coming up momentarily. We will be talking about his new book, Memories from the Microphone, A Century of Baseball Broadcasting. Before we get to that and officially welcomed Curt to the program, we do want to remind you that this and all of our other virtual programs here at the Hall of Fame are brought to you through the generosity of the Ford Motor Company. We thank Ford Motor Company for being our primary sponsor throughout 2021. Well, joining us today, Curt Smith. He has written the new book, Memories from the Microphone, A Century of Baseball Broadcasting. For Curt, this is book number 18. He's currently, and has been for a number of years now, senior lecturer of English at the University of Rochester. One time was our symposium speaker, the Cooperstown Symposium, which is one of the great academic / baseball events that takes place in the United States. He delivered the keynote at one of those programs. He's been a longtime friend of mine, longtime friend of the Hall of Fame. We're very glad to have with us Curt Smith. Curt, how you doing?
Just fine, Bruce, and thanks for inviting me again. It's always a treat to be talking to folks from the most famous Hall of Fame in the United States, located in America's best known small town. So it is great to be with you.
And I will agree with you on both of those points. Well said. Curt, your new book, Memories from the Microphone, A Century of Baseball Broadcasting, it is out today. And this is the 100th anniversary of a major event in the history of baseball. This was the day, 1921. 100 years ago, that we had the first broadcast of a Major League Baseball game between the Phillies and the Pirates. We're going to talk a lot more in depth about that event and really go in depth on the history of baseball broadcasting, talk about some of the legendary broadcasters that we have enjoyed in the past, but also continue to enjoy to this day. We do want to remind folks that your new book is available at the Hall of Fame website. And if you actually go to this link here, and I'm going to keep it up there for a little bit just so that people can write it down, it's shop.baseballhall.org/memories from the microphone. And there are dashes in between memories from the microphone. So shop.baseballhall.org/memories from the microphone. This book, a brand new publication from Curt Smith, forward by another great friend of the Hall of Fame third baseman Brooks Robinson. And it is officially out today on this 100th anniversary. All right, Curt, let's go back to that day, August 5th, 1921. KDKA radio in Pittsburgh. At the time, it was a relatively small radio station. It has grown and has become really one of the most prestigious stations in the country. And the gentleman we see in the photograph on the left here, somewhat forgotten today, but Harold Arlen was the man who delivered the play-by-play. Pirates versus the Phillies took place in Pittsburgh. Tell us about this milestone event.
Well, the person that we're looking at right now was the Cortez, the Coronado, if you would, of baseball broadcasting. The great explorer. No one had ever done baseball, play-by-play, color of any kind on radio because the wireless, as it was then called, had debuted on KDKA, which is America's first commercially licensed station, on election night of 1920. And over the next few months, the station began to do more politics, but also a number of minor sports events. But the big enchilada was on August 5th of 1921, 100 years ago. And they were looking for programming. And Harold Arlen was a Westinghouse company foreman, Westinghouse owning for many decades KDKA. And so Harold Arlen volunteered to go out to Forbes Field, which is, in my view, the most beautiful ballpark, perhaps, in the Major League history of the game. And he sat in a box seat behind a screen behind home plate in the first row. He had the best seat available in the ballpark to describe what he was about to see. And then he put a plank of wood over the seat itself, upon which he put his scorecard. He had no other artifact except for a telephone, which he used going back to KDKA as his transmitter. And with that extraordinarily Spartan paraphernalia, he was often speaking, although he wasn't sure really in that first game what he was supposed to speak about, except baseball, which lent a certain trailblazing air, I think, to the whole game. That was the beginning.
Yeah, Curt, was this a live broadcast, or was there somewhat of a delay before it went over the air?
No, it was live when it was on. But keep in mind that Arlen had no idea at that point how many people were actually listening to the game, if anyone, because there was only a handful of radio sets in the tri-state area, that is Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Eastern Ohio. And even those who had sets, he didn't know if they were tuned to KDKA, which was then only 100 watts in strength. For a long time now, it's been 50,000 watts. So it went from an almost a somnolent beginning to the booming Leviathan that KDKA is today. So that was an unknown to him. Was anyone listening? And secondly, was the equipment working? He couldn't tell. And in fact, listeners could tell because the transmitter would go off and on. But despite the fact that it was not a smooth kind of debut, it was rather lasting since it's been with us now for the last century. And that game had a lot of action to it. The Pirates beat the Phillies 8-5. The game and the lead seesawed back and forth. And so it was very well received. And the Pirates soon were broadcasting sporadically with Arlen behind the mic. He did them through 1925 when he went to Mansfield, Ohio for a Westinghouse job. And that was the beginning. The Pirates really were the birthplace, the incubator, if you would, of everything that we know today.
You mentioned that he had to broadcast from a box seat. There was no press box, no announcer's booth.
That's right.
He had to use a plank of wood to put his scorecard. This was not a very comfortable situation. This was nothing like a modern day broadcast or even a broadcast that we would see, let's say, in the 1930s or 40s. This was very primitive, to say the least.
Well, it was also primitive, his original style. He didn't know that you were actually supposed to speak between pitches. So what he did was ball one outside, and then perhaps you'd have 10 seconds of silence. And then the pitcher would throw the ball. Pitchers waiting fewer seconds then than they sadly do today. And, listening at home, we would say now that, my goodness, he wasn't very good. But to those listening then, it was like a vision, like Saul on the Damascus Road. And he was very well received. The Times of London soon called him the best known radio announcer in the world. And you look in vain for negative written critiques of Arlen in the 20s because it was so new. Just this phenomenon of sound coming through the air was a novelty to almost every American. And it took off from there.
Curt, was Arlen a knowledgeable baseball fan? Did he have a pretty good background going into this experience?
I would say he was a casual baseball fan. He'd been brought up in the Midwest, and then he'd moved east to be with Westinghouse. He certainly was conversant with baseball, the hits, the runs, the errors, the 3 outs, the 3 strikes, everything that we take for granted then. But he didn't need an insightful and a very deep kind of understanding to do baseball then, because as far as the average fan was concerned, Harold Arlen at that point was the greatest announcer that they had ever heard, because he may have been the first announcer that they'd ever heard.
One of the interesting footnotes to this, as it turned out many years later, one of his descendants, a right-hand pitcher named Steve Arlen, would pitch in the
Right.
major leagues for the San Diego Padres.
Yeah, that was 1972. And Bob Prince, who by then had been the legendary voice of the Pirates for 20 years, invited Harold back to Forbes Field, the same ballpark where he had first worked in 1921. And he actually let Arlen do an inning of play-by-play. Prince was a very generous and good-feeling fellow, in addition to being a spectacular broadcaster for the Bucks and beloved to this day. And Prince told me that the reaction to Arlen in 1972 was even more effervescent than it had been in 1921. People listened because many people remembered, even then, what he had sounded like and what the impact had been.
Now, you sent me some notes a few days ago in preparation for this program, and you'd mentioned that there were some problems with the transmitter during the broadcast. It was
That's
not
right.
a smooth affair.
That's right. It precisely wasn't, which sort of left Arlen in the dark regarding how he had been responded to. Had people liked him? Had people even heard him? So it was very much trial and error, with emphasis, sadly, on the air, in not simply that first game, but for many years afterward, because this is not something that radio knew how to broadcast, or that broadcasters knew how to voice baseball. Baseball, I think, and I've talked to broadcasters in other sports who agree with this, is by far the most difficult sport of all, because of the time lag between the pitches. And if you're a marvelous anecdotist, if you're Harry Caray belling out, holy cow, it might be, it could be, it is, or telling stories, Mel Allen, Barber, Vin Scully, Dizzy Dean, I know these are some of the people that we'll address. But he didn't know then, as I mentioned, that he was actually supposed to speak in between each pitch. But again, because the pace was much more active and much quicker then, the effect of Arlen's silence was minimized, because you had more of an emphasis on action, not anecdote.
Of course, he was the solo broadcaster. There was no such thing as a color announcer or an analyst.
Right.
This was Arlen solo for 9 innings, broadcasting the Pirates and the Phillies. I guess, Curt, to this day, we don't really know how many people listened to the broadcast, but we do know that the majority of the game made it over the air on KDKA.
That's right. We simply don't know the numbers back then, because in many cases they're so minuscule. We do know several numbers. By 1923, 3 million American homes had a radio. A decade later, in 1933, 33 million homes had a radio. So by the decade of the Depression, it was the one communication medium that you had, and in many cases, because it was inexpensive, the only thing that you could afford. You could read or you could listen to the radio. There was really nothing in between.
Yeah. 100 years ago, the first broadcast of a major league game. We're going to talk about some of the other early pioneers and early milestones. In fact, another significant milestone was just 2 years later. We have the first World Series broadcast over the radio. And we have a gentleman here, Graham Mcnamee, who really became somewhat of a star in the 1920s, doing the play-by-play. Now, first question I had about Mcnamee, did he know much about baseball? I've heard that he didn't. I don't know how true that is, though.
He knew very little, about as little as you can know and still do your sport. He'd been a concert singer and an opera voice, and a wonderful voice. The timbre of the voice really carried him through what was an illustrious career. He was known as the King because he dwarfed all broadcasters of the 1920s. Not every team broadcast their games locally. In fact, even by 1936, only 13 of 16 teams broadcast locally. The Dodgers, the Giants, and the Yankees feared radio's appeal. They thought it would keep people at home, not trooping to the ballpark. So if you were particularly in the Americas south of the Potomac and west of the Mississippi, you got very little baseball because you had no local team, no major league team.
Mm.
And if you were lucky, you heard the All-Star game beginning in 1933, and then the World Series, of course. And Mcnamee, in 1922, was asked by NBC to broadcast a few games, and he did, 1923 actually. And that year, he was assigned to the World Series and to do color. But he was so good, and the other announcers broadcasting were so inferior that he was given the game. And he broadcast the World Series through 1934. A lot of broadcasters and writers, too, resented him, resented his popularity, thought they knew more about the game than he did, which by and large was true. A writer once said of Mcnamee, I don't know which game to write about. The one I saw today at the Polo Grounds or the one I heard Graham Mcnamee announce. And those games were one and the same. He had a tendency to exaggerate. There was a hyperbole to him, but who cared? He was great theater. He knew how to tell a story. And that compensated for the fact that, no, he couldn't tell you probably a squeezed bunt from a Baltimore chop.
Wow, that was a cruel assessment. They did not give him much of a break, given his lack of knowledge, background in baseball, and given that this was still a very new a form of broadcasting, the idea of broadcasting a live sporting event. They were tough on him.
They were tough on him. A great deal of it was resentment because baseball before 1921 had been an entirely literary and written and reading occupation. If you wanted to follow baseball, this is how you did it. You read about it in books, in magazines, in the daily newspaper, and there were a lot of papers, 13 English-speaking dailies in New York City alone in the 1920s. And so writers looked at Mcnamee as a threat not simply to baseball in their view, but a threat to their own livelihood, because all of a sudden the emphasis and the hyperbole, the great perspective of baseball turned from being only a written sport to very much being a hearing and later on with television, a watching sport.
Curt, I'd like to talk about the photograph on the right side of the screen. It's actually the cover photo. It's a great photograph. I'm not sure exactly if that's from 23 or maybe later on, but he appears to be holding some sort of a small handheld microphone. Do you know anything about that?
Well, this is something that broadcasters did on occasion, and Mcnamee liked to do this in particular. That is, he would wade into a crowd, get himself a seat, much like Franz Laux did, only he got better accommodations now, and he would broadcast. He liked to do it because it brought in the drama of the crowd. The crowd is spectator. Instead of that, they became a participant. And Mcnamee had a voice which, no matter how loud the crowd was able to rise above it. So it was very distinctive. He would begin every broadcast, "This is Graham Mcnamee speaking." And at the end, he would repeat that and say, "Goodbye, all." And then, of course, he came back for the rest of the series and the next year for the series after that. No regular season baseball, though, on radio. It was a local team enterprise. Only, as I said, the All-Star game and the series were networked and thus went coast to coast.
Now, as we progress through the 1920s and into the early and mid 1930s, radio, baseball on radio really starts to explode. By 1936, 13 of the 16 major league teams are broadcasting games on the radio. Were the majority of these live broadcasts, Curt, or were there a lot of recreated broadcasts being done as well?
Well, the majority of games at home were live because it was very easy to go to the ballpark, set up your apparatus, go to a press box, or sit in the box seat and broadcast the game. Away games were an entire beast. Wire costs made them cost prohibitive in many cases, almost all, in fact. So what happened was the birth of the recreation. The Cubs' Pat Flanagan was the founder of the recreation. Perhaps the most famous exponent was Ronald Reagan, who did the Cubs for WHO Des Moines in Iowa. The recreation was exactly what it sounded like. You reinvented the game. Let's say Reagan was doing a game at Wrigley Field or on the road. an official at the spot would send very Spartan information over the air to Reagan or to any broadcaster doing the game in studio. For example, Reagan would see this and only this, BO1. What does that mean? It means ball one outside. What about S2C? It meant strike two called. What about a ground ball to shortstop who threw to first base for an out? It would say out, 6-3, and that's all he got. And so the need to invent, to bring a theater of the mind, imagination of the game, really became foremost. And Reagan told me once when I was doing a book, he said, merging fact and fancy, what perfect training for politics. And indeed it was, because he made things up. You tried to keep, particularly Reagan doing recreation in Des Moines, three other stations did the Cubs as well, but they did them live. So Reagan had to, in effect, intersperse story and anecdote and his knowledge of the game in between each pitch and each out that he got. But if you were good, you often became better than the game. There's a great story about Reagan. I'll tell it very briefly. Reagan's at WHO Des Moines. He's doing a Cubs game, and three other stations are doing it, but they're doing it live on the spot. Reagan's doing it from hundreds of miles away. And he's telling about, for example, Dizzy Dean is on the mound for the Cardinals. Augie Galan of the Cubs is at bat when something catastrophic happens. The wire went dead. Reagan asked himself, what do I do? And the answer came to him instantly, make a big to-do. He knew that if he said the wire is down, we're going to return to our station for transcribed music, what would happen? Listeners would turn from Reagan to the other three stations doing the game live. It had no wire for a wire to be broken. So Reagan, for the next 10 minutes, tells about a tornado that's occurred and a thunderstorm that's just happened. Actually, that didn't happen. He made it up. He talked about Dizzy Dean getting in a fight with an umpire. That didn't happen. He talked about other things as well. A manager coming out of the dugout to dispute a call, never happened. And then came his great centerpiece. Galan at bat. Reagan starts Galan following off pitches because he says to himself, what's the one thing that doesn't get in the box score? And the answer came to him. Foul balls. You can have 2 million foul balls and you still have 2 strikes. Mm-hmm. So for the next 8 to 9 minutes, Reagan is talking about all of these things, including Augie Galan setting a world record for foul balls. He's hitting one to the left, one to the right, one out of the ballpark, one which probably went to River Junction. Anything that would keep the audience glued. And then finally, after 8 to 9 minutes, Reagan got a message passed from the transcriber at Wrigley Field. And what it said was, batter popped out on first pitch.
That's great. It's interesting. Even when things didn't go wrong like that, they never got the pitch sequence. They had to make that up. And they couldn't just, have the outcome of the at-bat occur on the first pitch, because nobody's going to believe that every hitter's swinging at the first pitch.
Right.
Or if it was a strikeout, obviously there needed to be 2 strikes prior to the third strike. So that entire pitch sequence leading up to the outcome of the at-bat, that's almost completely the imagination of the recreator.
It is. Again, Reagan's genius in this case was that he knew that no one would ever know except the people at the ballpark, because he checked the box score the next inning, the next day. It never has what count went to what batter and how many fouls were hit. And so in that sense, Reagan had great freedom to improvise, and improvise he did.
Curt, when did Flanagan do the first recreated broadcast, and when did recreated broadcasts finally go by the wayside?
Well, he did the first recreated broadcast in the late 1920s. Chicago was really the cradle of baseball broadcasting. And Jack Brickhouse, Bob Elson, Harry Caray in time. But before them, a whole panoply of announcers did radio baseball in the 20s and 30s. Gradually over the years, they were able to lessen the expense of sending someone to a game on the road. And so in 1955, the Pirates were the last team to do any recreations, and they only did several. Then they went to live games, both at Forbes Field and also on the road. So back then, although some people, Les Kiter, for example, comes to mind in New York City after the Giants had moved west to San Francisco. For several years, he recreated the Giants games, even though they were playing 3,000 miles away. So the recreation is a revered art form because so much depended not simply on the announcer's voice, but on the announcer's mind.
Another practitioner of the recreated broadcast was this man, Rosie Rosewell. He did Pirates games from 1936 to 1954.
Yeah.
And we actually have a photograph of him, appears to be in a studio with, I don't know if that's a flute, some sort of a musical effect that he's using. Tell us about Rosie.
Well, Rosie Rosewell was one of my favorites because he was so absolutely Byzantine and bizarre. He loved the game. And in fact, almost lived for it. Used to go with the Pirates on road trips even before he became their broadcaster. And he broadcast them for 19 years. And he had great sayings. For example, a doozy Marooney was an extra base hit. A dipsy doodle was a strikeout. But Rosie's pièce de résistance is without a doubt the most indelible and incredible home run call of all time. Rosie invented a fictitious character named Aunt Minnie, who, as I suggest, did not exist. He simply made her up, and everyone in Pittsburgh knew he made her up. But like the emperor with no clothes, no one would say she's not for real. So whenever a Pirate hit a ball at Forbes Field or by recreation on the road, and Rosie thought it might be a home run, he would say, "There's a long drive going back into the outfield." Pause. "Aunt Minnie, open your window." At that point, Rosie would have someone adjacent to him, an assistant, standing on a piece of chair, holding a piece of glass. And when Rosie said, "Aunt Minnie, here she, the baseball comes," he would then point to the assistant. The assistant would drop the pane of glass on the floor. And if you were sitting at home, you're thinking, "My goodness, Aunt Minnie didn't make it again. Her window was broken." And so it was. So Rosie would say, "Oh, that's too bad. Aunt Minnie once again didn't make it. She tripped over her garden hose." So that was Rosie Rosewell. And as I said, there have been many wonderful home run calls, but none quite in Rosie's league.
In today's more cynical world, I'm guessing that would not be accepted, but back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, people like this?
Oh, yes, they loved it. Oh, today you'd call it misinformation. Thank God in this case for misinformation. Pittsburgh loved it. And his three-state market, as I said, of Ohio and West Virginia as well, for many years with Rosie and then with his successor, Bob Prince, the Pirates led the major leagues in the percentage, not the total because it wasn't that large a market, but in the percentage of radio and television sets turned to baseball. That's how popular they were.
We're going to stick with Pittsburgh for a moment here. And actually, the Pittsburgh theme is why I chose the colors for this presentation, the black and gold for the Pirates. We go from Rosie Rosewell to the most legendary Pirate announcer of all time, the great, the colorful Bob Prince. And you knew him, right?
I knew Prince very well. But then anybody in Pittsburgh listening to Prince felt that they knew him very well. Bob Prince became an extended member of the family, as great baseball broadcasters tend to do. And he broadcast the Pirates from 1928. He was Rosie's assistant for about 6 years. And then upon Rosewell's death, he broadcast the Pirates through 1975. Steve Blass, the great former pitcher and broadcaster of the Pirates, told me several times he believes Bob Prince was the single most beloved and important, influential figure in Pittsburgh baseball history, which really, when you think of it, covers a lot of territory. Pie Traynor, Honus Wagner, Ralph Kiner, and of course, the person, Bruce, that you wrote about so beautifully in one of your books, and that is Roberto Clemente. And Prince outshone them all in the sense of becoming the embodiment of the Pirates. Not as great an athlete clearly as Clemente, who was in a league of his own, but in terms of his impact, his effect. I went to school at Allegheny College in Western Pennsylvania, 90 miles from Pittsburgh, and I can tell you, when Prince was doing the Pirates, you could walk up and down the street, one radio after another, from inside someone's house or someone on the front porch listening to the gunner. The gunner was called that, incidentally, because once he was at a bar and a man pulled a gun on him because Prince had been talking to the man's wife, and ergo gunner, he was born. But he had an extraordinary effect. He would say of a game, we had them all the way, or how sweet it is in terms of another victory. And he would just intrude himself, not in a bad way, but become synergistic with the broadcast. He, like Rosewell, knew that, as Rosewell taught Bob Prince, that it's not the play-by-play that matters, it's between the pitches that counts. Bingo. Anyone who's ever listened to a Prince or Harry Caray, a Mel Allen, a John Miller, or Bob Costas knows that's precisely true. Yes, you have to broadcast the balls and strikes and the action, but the action is so sporadic that, boy, you get a chance to inject your own personality into baseball to an extent that an announcer does not get in any other sport.
You mentioned we had him all the way, which he would say even after, a game went down to the final strike. Maybe the Pirates had blown a 3-run lead and it came down to a 1-run game with the bases loaded. But he always would end it, we had him all the way.
Yeah.
And another thing that he did was his home run call, "You can kiss it goodbye." Was he one of the first play-by-play men to have a trademark home run call?
Well, no. Mel Allen in the late 1940s, when he was breaking in, actually had been the Yankees broadcaster for 8 or 9 years. By accident, he said one day, "It's going," and he didn't know if the fielder was going to be able to catch the Yankee drive. So then he said, "Gone." And listeners liked it so much that after Allen hadn't used it for several games, they wrote in and they telephoned, "What happened to going, gone?" So that, along with "How about that," which Mel Allen made into a national institution, became only 2 of his many calling cards. And the same was true with Prince. The same is true of any great broadcaster. You become, in effect, synonymous with the broadcast itself and with the team or the network for which you work.
Curt, I'm curious about the photograph that I put up on the right side there. We see Prince on the left. Is that Rosewell or another broadcaster?
That is Rosewell, and that was the game that you mentioned earlier in 1972 when Steve Arlen of San Diego pitched against the Pirates. Oh. And he invited Rosewell back for an inning, and the reaction was just gigantic. People remembered, even those who had not been alive in 1921 in the early 20s, but their fathers and their mothers or grandfathers might have told them how it was with Rosie Rosewell.
I know Prince and Clemente were good friends. Was Prince generally well liked by the Pirate players?
Beloved. First of all, he was not too critical, let's be honest. He was the biggest bucko booster of all and took great pride in that. But in addition to that, the Pirates had a lot of Black and Hispanic ball players in the 60s. And bigotry then was more acceptable, thank goodness, than it is today. And so Prince befriended them, not simply invited them to his home, but he helped to work out their contracts. He on occasion would go with the ball player, with the player's agent, and negotiated rights fees for the players, their salaries with the Pirates announcers and the players. And so he truly became, and I don't use exaggeration here, beloved by the players. When Clemente, after Clemente won, I think four silver bats for National League batting championships, This was after the 1971 season. And he invited Prince down to Latin America, where, of course, he was from. And they had a ceremony where Roberto Clemente gave Bob Prince his first silver bat, which he had won for the 1961 batting title. And Clemente said that silver bat meant as much to him as the Pirates winning the World Series in 1960. So yes, I mean, Prince was truly not fawned upon particularly, but he was enormously well regarded, better than not well regarded by the Pirates players themselves.
And that was such a heavily integrated team, especially during the 1960s. Prince was able to connect, it seems, with just about everybody on that club. Let's talk about another beloved broadcaster, Ernie Harwell, obviously best known for his days in Detroit, but very early on, once traded for a player. And this is not an exaggeration. This actually happened.
No, that's exactly the case. This was in 1948. Red Barber, the Dodgers broadcaster, had hemorrhaged an ulcer. So Branch Rickey, the Dodgers GM, needed a broadcaster. Well, he had heard just how good, verging on great, Ernie Harwell was broadcasting for AAA Atlanta. Harwell, of course, from the South. And so he called the Atlanta Crackers, and he engineered a deal by which Harwell would come to Ebbets Field in exchange for the Dodgers AAA catcher, Cliff Dapper, who went to Atlanta. And so this is the first, and as far as I know, only time in which a player has been dealt for a broadcaster. But how apt that was in Ernie's case, because he was a great student of history. He wrote about history. He was the author of many books. He was the author of the lyricist for many songs, including "Move Over, Babe, Here Comes Henry." And he started the baseball chapel program. He, in many ways, was an entertainer. He sang a duet with Pearl Bailey. So this is as close as the term Renaissance comes, I think, to a baseball broadcaster ever. And he also brought that kind of a pioneering technique to the booth itself. He would say, the batter stood there like a house by the side of the road, became his most oft-cited line. He would say of the Red Sox and Tigers, for example, he would call them the Bostons and the Detroits. And he would also use a technique which I don't believe has ever been used by a broadcaster, but he was the first if there has. And that is, if a ball was hit into the stands, Ernie would say, and it was caught by a man from Alma, Michigan, or East Lansing, Michigan, or Grand Rapids, or Detroit. Of course, he didn't know any of them, but who was to say that he didn't listening to the game? In fact, I was just a little kid at the time, listening to the Tigers from upstate New York, my small town there, across the lake to Detroit over the booming 50,000 watt WJR. And I remember telling my mom as I was listening to this game, being totally oblivious, of course, to the truth, I said, gee, Mom, Ernie Harwell really has a lot of friends. And of course, the great irony is that he did have a lot of friends. He may have been the most beloved, not simply broadcaster in baseball, but certainly, I think, ranking among the most beloved people on or off the field.
So in Brooklyn, he teamed up with Red Barber?
And Connie Desmond, not a bad trifecta. The Yankees at the same time had Mel Allen and Jim Woods, and then Barber after he moved over from New York. Again, we're from Brooklyn. There too, not a bad trifecta. New York has been very rich in baseball broadcasting skill.
When we talk about the most colorful broadcasters in history, it's hard to top this man. He had been a standout pitcher, a Hall of Famer, and then he carved out this second niche, the second career as a broadcaster, Dizzy Dean. He was a guy that emphasized fun over the numbers.
Well, he did. And there he's wearing the Stetson. He would often wear a wild Hawaiian shirt. He would have the cowboy belt buckle, the boots, the whole rustic look. And as Bill McPhail, the president of CBS Sports, said of the 1954 through 1965 reign of baseball's Game of the Week, actually 1953, if you count the first year on ABC. He said in Middle America, this is an exact quote, watching Dizzy Dean was a religion, an absolute religion. And I can attest from growing up in a town of 2,000 people, it was a religion. You literally, during those years of the 50s and early 60s, could tell from the volume of traffic and business uptown in our small town whether Dizzy Dean was doing the Game of the Week that day. He did them on Saturday and Sunday each week for many years, but every once in a while he would take a week off. The pace was too much for him, and he would go to Las Vegas or somewhere like that. But he was an extraordinary presence. He was when he came to Cooperstown after he had retired and after he had left Game of the Week, and came to induction day. He would routinely get the loudest ovation of anyone among Hall of Famers or active players. And Pee Wee Reese, who did the Game of the Week with him on CBS from 1960 through 1965, after Dean had died and after Reese had left broadcasting, Pee Wee would go around to card shows. And of course, he had been the beloved captain of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And Pee Wee once told me, he said, shaking his head, said, nobody wanted to talk about the Dodgers or the world title or those World Series against the Yankees. Everyone said the same thing. Baseball ain't been the same since you and old Diz left. To which Dizzy would say, Padna, you ain't just a woofin'.
He, of course, was known for butchering the English language, mispronouncing words. Do you think he did that intentionally? Or
Yes.
was he just not that well versed in proper English grammar?
I've talked to Buddy Blattner, who did the Game of the Week before Pee Wee. He says it was absolutely intentional. Dean was bright enough to know that he had this magnificent persona, all 300 pounds of it. Dean would call people Padna. He would sing Wabash Cannonball during the game. He would become a combination of Ma Kettle, Tennessee Ernie Ford, and anyone else that you wanted to name in the country music business. And so he would say a runner slid into third, or a pitcher throwed the ball, or runners are now returning to their respectable bases. He knew the term was respective, of course. Yeah. And he just would go in this case, very, very roguish or bogish as it would be named today. Just an extraordinary presence. Mel Allen broadcast 2 years with the Yankees and told me that Dean once accidentally said slid instead of slud. He never made that mistake again.
Another very colorful character, Caray. I don't know if he was the first broadcaster to really become beloved with multiple franchises, but he really did. Cardinals, then the White Sox, then the Cubs. I guess he's best known for the Cubs now, but he did White Sox games for years. He did Cardinals games for years.
He did.
There's an affinity that all those fan bases have for him.
Well, that's absolutely true. I don't know who the most beloved broadcaster is in baseball history, although you can make a case for Harry Caray. But I do believe that no broadcaster ever loved the game more than Harry Caray did. He broadcast the Cardinals from the early 1940s through 1969, then went over or 68 rather, and broadcast the White Sox for about 12, 13 years. Then became a national institution as opposed to the Cardinals' regional institution then with the Chicago Cubs. The Cubs, along with the Atlanta Braves, really christened Superstation baseball, cable TV in the 1970s and the 1980s. So here Harry comes over in 1982 from Comiskey Park to Wrigley Field. WGN becomes a superstation, which means it has access to every American living room, coast to coast. Imagine baseball every night on the air. It's almost as good, Harry would tell you, as an open bar. So there he goes, Harry Caray, and he soon was in 20 million homes, those who subscribed to cable. But it was available in literally every household in the nation. And they became acquainted with the genius of Caray. whether it was the home run call, it might be, it could be, it is, holy cow. One game in 1984, the Cubs were on their way to the pennant, and after saying "holy cow," Harry said, "The good Lord wants the Cubs to win." Well, clearly he did, or at least allowed it, because the Cubs won their first National League pennant here at Division since 1945. He became, in many ways, the absolute face and voice of network or cable baseball.
A great broadcaster, but a strong personality. Struggled in his relationships with some of his broadcast partners, Jimmy Pearsall, Milo Hamilton.
Yes.
They clashed.
Well, Milo Hamilton went to his grave, and I love the guy, but he couldn't shake the fact or at least the belief that Harry Caray had got him fired from two positions during his career. I think you can make that case, in fact. So Harry, he was a piece of work to work with, but an even greater piece of work to hear.
I remember some of the broadcasts that he did with Jimmy Pearsall. We used to get some White Sox games in the New York area, late 70s, early 80s. That's when cable first came to our homes in Westchester County. And you could kind of tell there was tension between him and Jimmy.
Yeah, you really could. But it was not simply him. It was, as I said, Milo probably above all. Some worked with him brilliantly. Jack Buck, the great voice of the Cardinals and later CBS Radio and TV, did games with Harry from 1955 till Harry was axed at the end of the 1968 season. And they were very different broadcasters, but they both loved the game. They knew the game, and they were inordinately entertaining. You couldn't get enough. But I think that Jack understood that Harry was the voice of the Cardinals, that you weren't going to change him. So basically go about your business as broadcast as you can. You can make a case, at least in my book, that Kerry and Buck were the best twosome in Major League Baseball history. Of course, there are many other contenders as well, but they would be amongst them, as old Diz would say.
Curt, you mentioned a few minutes ago WTBS in the mid-1970s. So in 1976, Ted Turner purchases the Atlanta Braves, and he also takes control of this superstation, cable station, WTBS, out of Atlanta, and broadcasts Braves games across the country on a nightly basis. Now, this is a bit of a later photograph, I'm guessing early 80s, but the original trio of broadcasters for TBS, Skip Caray, Harry's son, and then two other terrific announcers, Ernie Johnson and Pete Van Wieren.
Yes.
And these three guys collectively, that's Billy Sample, a friend of mine who's on the right. He joined the Braves later on. But Caray, Johnson, and Van Wieren collectively, they really changed the landscape of baseball coverage.
They did, and that is no exaggeration. It was a wonderful trio, trifecta, if you would. There's a Latin phrase, primus inter pares. It means first among equals. I know that only because my mother was a Latin teacher. But Ernie Johnson was first among equals. He was the voice of the Braves. And the other two were spectacular talents. But Ernie brought a humor, a down south kind of civility, didn't take himself too seriously, was laid back, self-effacing, very easy to take. And America took him gratefully for more than 20 years. Yes, they were terrific. In fact, 1982 was the first year that cable really became a phenomenon. It had been with us for a number of years before that, but that was the year that the Atlanta Braves set a record by winning their first 13 big league games. And Ernie told me once that this was the 2x4 that had hit America over the head with the potential impact of what cable could be. Before then, except for local broadcasting, which varied widely across the country, and maybe a game of the week on a Saturday afternoon, and maybe an occasional Monday night game with ABC, that was it. And all of a sudden, thanks to the Braves, Ted Turner, and then the Cubs with WGN and several other superstations, you're getting Major League Baseball, wall to wall, coast to coast, every night of the year. And for 15 years, until baseball very errantly and mistakenly, in my view, decided to rein them in because They were actually hurting the local broadcasts, proving more popular than your local teams. For those 15 years, it was a golden era of baseball broadcasting, not simply in who did the games, but in what and how the games reached you.
We're going to go back in time a little bit to the 1940s, and really, I guess, the two kings of the hill. When you talk about baseball broadcasting, they were the inaugural winners of the Hall of Fame's Ford C. Frick Award. Mel Allen doing the Yankee games, Red Barber doing the Brooklyn Dodger games, and a bit of a rivalry between the two of them.
Great rivalry between the two of them, although they would never admit to that publicly. They were both from the South. Mel from Johns, Alabama. Red, born in Mississippi, went to school in Florida. And Red came to Cincinnati first in 1935, broadcast the Reds through 1938. Larry McPhail moves to Brooklyn as their owner, and he brings Barber along to Ebbets Field. And through 1953, Red Barber became the voice of Brooklyn. There's no other way to say it. This is a borough that was condescended to by Manhattan, as Red would say. And in Barber, they found their voice. They found their evangelist. And few people broadcast baseball better than Red, with the beauty of the language, talking about how the clouds that so many ball players liked because they made catching a fly ball easier. He would say, well, there are very few clouds in the form of angels out today, meaning angels, of course, to the broadcast, to the ball players. And he had this lovely Southern accent, so easy to take, very subtle. He was extraordinarily impartial. He thought, I think, that saying a biased word would be unconstitutional. It certainly was in his book. And later decade and later years, listeners got a glimpse through the ear of what Barber was when he did commentary each Friday morning on the NPR radio. In fact, he won Broadcasting's Pulitzer for that award, and it was richly deserved. Mel Allen, if Barber was white wine crusette, grape crusette, and bluegrass music, Mel Allen was beer, Ballantine beer, of course, the Yankee sponsor. He was hot dogs, and he was the United States Marine Band. He had a fabulous voice. As I often say, if I go to the great hereafter and God's voice is Mel Allen's, I'll be quite pleased indeed. Of course, I may not make it upstairs to hear, but Allen's voice, as I've written, a florist must have decorated it. And a writer once said that if Mel Allen sold fish, he would make you think that Puccini wrote the score. In fact, he was such a great announcer. After the Yankees controversially fired him in 1964, he went through a decade of being blackballed on network radio and network television for reasons that are disputatious and I won't address now. But the point is, he was blackballed. Only in the mid-1970s, more than a decade after the Yankees had fired him, did Mel Allen return as the voice of This Week in Baseball. And he became the definition of what became sports' top-rated serialized sports serial. In fact, a brief story. Allen, this is 1977. He couldn't possibly have been heard by virtually anyone since 1964 because he had been blackballed. So I'm at home in my parents' home in upstate New York, fairly large first floor. I'm watching This Week in Baseball, and from the opposite end of the first floor comes my mother. My mother was not a big baseball fan, but she said to me, with no introduction, not having been able to hear him for 13 years, she says, "I can't believe it. Is that Mel Allen?" That's what you call presence, and Mel Allen had it. The very first, along with Red Barber, to receive the Ford C. Frick Award for Broadcast Excellence in 1978 from the Hall of Fame.
We often saw Mel Allen in Cooperstown, not only as the winner of the Ford C. Frick Award, but he would often come back and serve as public address announcer for the Hall of Fame game at Doubleday Field. Then we
And
have Vin Scully, and this certainly someone that maybe some of our younger fans can relate to because it's only been a couple of years since Vin Scully retired. I'll throw a couple of numbers at you. Well, you sent me these numbers: 25 World Series, 18 no-hitters, synonymous with the Dodger franchise, but also for a number of years synonymous with the NBC Game of the Week.
I don't think the Game of the Week has ever been broadcast more fluently with greater love than when Scully and Garagiola did the game from 1983 through 1989. And this was a capstone for Scully's career, which showed the nation, coast to coast, how superb, how sublime he was. Scully had done Dodger games at Ebbets Field through 1957, after which they moved to LA, after which Scully becomes the impresario of Southern California. And what Scully had was a love of baseball. He played baseball, center field for Fordham. He understood the game. He knew baseball history. He was the unofficial historian for the Dodgers broadcasting at Ebbets Field. And he had a wonderful vocabulary. He often said that his best friend on a road trip was a book. He read relentlessly, incessantly, most of the time on non-baseball books, which is why he had such a splendid vocabulary. But I'll never forget, this is 1991 rather, Game 6 of the World Series. I was then working in Washington, and I'm driving down Constitution Avenue, Game 6 of the Twins Braves World Series. And the Twins get a runner on second base. And Scully starts talking about Arthur Miller's The Death of the Salesman, comparing or likening rather to the runner at second base to what Miller called a tiny ship, and home plate as what Miller called a safe harbor. So the tiny ship was trying to reach safe harbor. The runner on second base was trying to reach the plate. Now, who else in the history of the game could fuse, amid the pressure of that moment, baseball and Broadway, the musical by Arthur Miller, or the play rather?
You mentioned Joe Garagiola a moment ago. He did play-by-play, but he also did color when teamed with Vin Scully. And you had told me that he was really the first color broadcaster on network TV to bring this keen sense of humor to the booth.
Well, I think he was. Joe Garagiola was a very bright and industrious man. And he became really as much of a star during his era as Bob Uecker did later in his. And he would talk about, at the very start of his campaign, of his career rather, he would talk a great deal about his boyhood friend, Yogi Berra. And he would talk about how Berra, in essence, once said that always remember to go to other people's funerals, otherwise they won't come to yours. So Berra humor is one of staples. In fact, many people accuse Garagiola mistakenly of writing some of Berra's funnies. They were composed by Yogi himself. And the other thing was, Garagiola never tired of making fun of his playing career, and there was some to make fun of. He had hit 257 with his with 4 teams, I think. And he said he was an expert in 2 things: trades and slumps. In 1952, he had played with the 42 rather, 112 last place Pittsburgh Pirates. And Joe said that we were the most courageous team in baseball history. We played 154 games and showed up for every one. That's Joe Garagiola.
Yeah. My favorite broadcaster of all time, Tony Kubick, I have to ask you about him. He brought a more analytical, studious approach to the game, completely the opposite from Garagiola, and yet they were a terrific tandem on NBC in the 1970s.
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier that Dizzy Dean called statistics statics, and he hated them because statistics are static. And generally, by and large, I think it's favored if you must choose fun and entertainment and stories over statistics, because statistics, as Scully said, too many broadcasters use statistics in the same way that a drunk uses a lamppost, for support, not illumination. But Tony Kubick is an exception to that. Yes, he would do what today we call analytics. Yes, he would use statistics, but there was a breadth of knowledge about him. He worked and he improved. He was not a good broadcaster when he joined NBC in 1966. He was a very fine broadcaster by the time that he retired in 1995. And he gives credit for this to Curt Gowdy, who was his longtime partner on Game of the Week, and who gave Kubick some hints about how Kubick could improve his style and could slow down, not be so much of a horse race from pitch to pitch, but to slow down, be relaxed, be funny once in a while. So Kubick was the first analyst only ever inducted at Cooperstown. By that I mean winning the Ford C. Frick Award, and I think he was a marvelous choice indeed.
Another broadcaster I want to talk about, very different from Tony Kubick, pretty much different from anybody, and that's Mr. Baseball, Bob Uecker. Delivered perhaps the funniest acceptance speech here in Cooperstown when he received the Frick Award a number of years ago. We have it on tape, and we sometimes play it for the staff here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. But you have a great story, an exchange between him and Howard Cosell on one of the ABC broadcasts they did.
Well, Johnny Carson, on whose show Uecker appeared more than 100 times, used to call you Mr. Baseball. And for many years, or at least for a number of years, Uecker did Monday Night Baseball for ABC. One of his partners was Howard Cosell. Uecker was what Cosell would call an ex-jock. And Cosell had little use for former athletes by and large. Cosell was a graduate of NYU Law School, very learned, although not as learned as he thought of himself. And he once said to Uecker, he said, Bob, you couldn't possibly know, for example, because you're a former athlete, former ball player, the definition of the word truculent. Okay, so like that, without missing a beat, Uecker turned to Cosell and said, sure I do, Howie. If you had a truck and I borrowed it, that would be a truculent. Now, that's improvisational genius as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there's no way that was planned ahead of time, and that was
no. And as you suggest,
Cosell taking a bit of a dig at Uecker, and Uecker gave it right back to him but in a nice way.
In a nice way, but he put Cosell in his place, and the country watching at that time applauded because they liked Uecker, and by and large, they knew that Cosell did not like baseball.
We're going to wrap things up today by talking about some of the African-American baseball pioneers among broadcasters.
Right.
Jackie Robinson was actually the first Black broadcaster to do network television. You can see him in front of the ABC microphone. And then later on, a man that I got to enjoy for so many years watching Yankee games in the 1970s and 80s, Bill White became the first Black man to do play-by-play for a major league team. And these two men are an important part of the story as well.
They're very important. It's rather historic and quite proper that Jackie Robinson, the first Black African-American to play Major League Baseball in 1947, should in 1965 become the first Black color broadcaster doing analysis and dissecting the game on NBC television, on the ABC television Game of the Week, or Major League Championship Baseball, as they called it. But Robinson became the first analyst, as it were, to be of African-American ancestry. And he had a high pitching voice, a high stabbing voice, a high pitch, but knew the game, worked very hard, but was sabotaged, in effect, not intentionally, but rather because the entire package was not put together well and was destroyed by Dizzy Dean, who was doing the Game of the Week on CBS at the very same time, in fact. So very few people watched Jackie Robinson. And then, of course, he broadcasts for Montreal for the Expos in 1972, which is rather apt on its own score, because he had begun his minor league career before going to Brooklyn with the Montreal Royals. And so he died in 1972, but had the chance before then to broadcast the Expos. So he was a pioneer in every sense of the term, on the diamond and off. Bill White began broadcasting the Yankees in 1971 and is still with them, or was for many years before he became president of the National League. What a career! An all-star baseball player, the first black play-by-playman, and then, of course, becoming the National League president. White was not a good broadcaster at first. He got the job through Howard Cosell, who heard him doing basketball in Philadelphia, called up Mike Burke, the owner of the Yankees, and said, "Why don't you give White a charge? And why don't you give him a chance?" And they did. And within 2 to 3 years, he had become a very fine broadcaster with the Yanks, and a foil with Phil Rizzuto. They're back and forth and entertained years of Yankee fans. But Bill White is looked upon with respect and with affection, as he should.
Equally adept at color broadcasting or doing play-by-play, was exceptionally good at both, and
yes,
always brought a calm, reasonable approach to the Rizzuto broadcast. They were perfect at blending with each other.
He was the first black to do play-by-play of a World Series as well for CBS Radio in the late 1970s.
Well, we've been talking with Curt Smith about the history of baseball broadcasting, going back to that first Major League broadcast 100 years ago today, and then looking at many of the great broadcasters that have emerged over the last 10 decades. The brand new book is Memories from the Microphone, A Century of Baseball Broadcasting. Curt Smith, the author, it's his 18th book, the foreword by the great third baseman Brooks Robinson. You can get the book at our website. Go to shop.baseballhall.org/memories from the microphone. Just make sure to include the dashes between memories from the microphone. If you forget about the dashes, just go to shop.baseballhall.org. You can do a search under Curt Smith. Either way, it'll take you right to the book. Curt, as always, it's a pleasure to talk to you. We always have fun learning from you, especially when it comes to one of your real niches, and that's not only baseball, but the art of baseball broadcasting. Thank you, Curt. Appreciate it.
Bruce, thank you very much.
Again, the book, Memories from the Microphone, A Century of Baseball Broadcasting. It is a terrific history of baseball behind the mic, starting in 1921 with Harold Arlen. Also, our thanks go to the Ford Motor Company for being our sponsor of today's program, the Virtual Author Series. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. Have a great day. Take care.